and socially much more graceful than I, and ended up with a scholarship to Harvard. And he went to Harvard. The the other thing about my grandfather that I remember is that he started off buying a little farm outside of town in 1895 for $3 an acre, and over the next 40 years added on, so that he ended up with about 700 acres of farmland, which by that time was on the edge of Baton Rouge, which Baton Rouge is the capital of Louisiana, and its value became very great. Its value reached a point where after he died, they offered someone offered to buy it for $2 million, and my Aunt Jo was so peculiar that she refused to sell her share so that nobody could sell any of it. And they held on to it for another 10 years until the value decreased. And she got some money out of it, but not nearly what they could have had. The other thing he did, grandfather Stumberg did, that I thought was real interesting was that he built a swimming pool in the Mississippi River. Back in those days, there was no such thing as swimming pools, but the Mississippi River ran right in back of our house. And what he did was to anchor some 2x8s around the edge of the river, so people could go swimming in there and not run the risk of floating down the river. He trusted me. I had a great time because he trusted me to go up to Detroit, Michigan to pick up a Ford, 1937 Ford, that he found he could save $200 by my picking it up. So he was pretty frugal, and I hitchhiked up to Detroit and drove it back and felt like a real big shot doing this. As you were treated in Detroit, you were treated to a tour of the factory, and they all thought you were a great guy buying this Ford. I think it cost about $675. And it was fun. The years in Baton Rouge went along rapidly. I went to Louisiana State University, and I did great the first year, made straight A's, and and that sort of thing. I was making A's in French, and my grandfather and wasn't studying. I found you could make A's in some courses without studying, and Grandpa didn't think that was a good idea, and told me I should drop the French and take German, which he was teaching, and which I more or less had to do. And unfortunately, I never made A's in German. I never could quite do that. At LSU, I took pre-med, not knowing for sure what I was going to do. And about the junior year, I realized that I wasn't going to go to medical school because we didn't have any extra money for that. And so I, number one, got a government student job at $15 a month working in the bacteriology department. And I used that $15 to pay back $150 that I borrowed to pay my grandparents for the room and board for the year. And I thought that was, I learned a good lesson that life is not always free, but that if you work at it, you can get things done. Bacteriology at LSU was the beginning of my interest in going to graduate school. I did a research project, and this allowed my professor there to write a strong letter to Ohio State, Michigan, and California graduate schools of bacteriology. And I got accepted at Ohio State, and that got me started on my way for the degree in bacteriology. I would say that I bought, in preparation, I bought a used overcoat for $5 and put it in a suitcase and hitchhiked up to from Baton Rouge up to Columbus, Ohio, to start my Ohio State years. One thing that was a lot of fun and made a great impression on me was going to vacation on Grand Isle, which is an island off the coast of Louisiana. It was my neighbor, Sandy Kazdasou, had a Model A Ford, and he and I and Henry Harris, who was in pre-med with me, decided we would take a vacation down there. It was about a 150-mile drive, but he had the car, and so we got permission from the Dr. Berry in the zoology department to borrow a tent that they had at the field station down in Grand Isle. And so we had a place to camp out on the beach on Grand Isle. Grand Isle was sort of a tropical paradise as far as I'm concerned. It was tropical. It was had a history of Grand Terre was the island right next to Grand Isle, and Grand Terre was where Jean Lafitte, the pirate, had his headquarters. And on Grand Isle, finally, one of his lieutenants had set up retirement there and still had a little store that you could shop in there. Well, we stayed on Grand Isle for about 3 days, and the wind blew like mad, blew sand in everybody's eyes and mouth. We didn't know the cattle used the beach as stomping grounds, and every morning about 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, they would come stomping through. And finally, Henry Harris and Sandy agreed that it was just not worth it anymore to stay on vacation. And I just loved the place, so I went to a little old rickety hotel, the only hotel there, and asked if they had any kind of a job. And they were happy to see me, and I think I got room and board and $5 a week or something like that, so that I stayed on the island for another month in the summer. And I say all of this because on Saturday night on Grand Isle, the they brought in the local honky tonk brought in a 3-man band from New Orleans of black trumpet player and a black piano player and clarinetist, and they played jazz while the natives, the Cajuns, all came with their mothers, brought their kids there, and the kids, anywhere from age 10 to 15, would dance half the night while they played this great jazz. And I got exposed to jazz there and have been listening and enjoying up to the present time New Orleans jazz. And fact is, in later years, we made trips to New York and listened to Sidney Bechet, who's a great clarinetist. We, in later years, had friends that would call and say, we hear that Louis Armstrong is playing in San Francisco and we're coming down. Do you want to make reservations? And we'll go to the Black Hawk over in San Francisco. And so jazz has played a role in our lives up to and including our 50th wedding anniversary, where we had Bob Schultz, who was a important part of Turk Murphy's band in San Francisco, played at our 50th wedding anniversary. Had a great time. The other thing that happened in Baton Rouge that I should mention, because it is a little bit different. Back in those days, there was a tree sitting craze. And by that I mean the people all over the United States would build a little platform, a house up in a tree somewhere and sit up there. And it started off and being reported in the papers if they were sitting for 2 days or 3 days. Well, my cousin Tyke and I decided that we could do that. We built a little tree house in the camphor tree on the front yard, and we, thank goodness, my Aunt Nancy persuaded Grandma that not to object to John and to Tyke and I tree sitting. Grandma thought that was awful silly, but we thought it would be a lot of fun, and our sisters all agreed to handle the buckets of disposables that came from staying in the tree for 3 days, and they came down and interviewed us from the paper, so we got written up for someone. I think after the 3rd day, why we gave up and came down, but we stayed up long enough to get written up in the State Times paper. And I thought that was an experience. The other experience is that was my first, the next door neighbor was Frances Casdessu, and she was my first girlfriend, and she came up in the tree, and I kissed her. That was the first kiss. She married someone else. So I hitchhiked up to Columbus, Ohio, to start my graduate assistantship at Ohio State University. And I got on the streetcar on High Street, the streetcar that would go up High Street to the university. And while sitting there, some guy in the middle of town came down and sat down beside me and started talking. And it turned out to be a fellow named Don Johnson, who was going to law school. And to make a long story short, he and I became fast friends. I roomed, he was looking for a roommate in a room. I think it cost $3 a month, but it was the four of us were in one bedroom, so that someone was making $12 a month from the one bedroom. Don, I was his best man, and he got married about 2 years into law school, and we kept in touch then for the rest of our lives as long as he lived. And Don and Virginia, his wife, were good friends of ours, and we would visit in their home frequently. And when he was vice president of Nationwide Insurance there in Columbus, and would take trips around the world involving co-op life insurance in different countries. And he would manage to stop in San Francisco fairly often. And when he did, why, we would always get invited to lunch in San Francisco. And the Nationwide had an arrangement with a hotel chain that if there was a suite available, any of their travelers could get a suite for the price of a room. And so we'd go over there and we'd see him in this huge suite with a grand piano and all kinds of things. And we'd then go down and have dinner in the nicest restaurants in the hotel. And he was pretty knowledgeable about dinners and wines by that time, so that we kid ourselves. We talk about when we went to dinner that he ordered a Chateau Margaux bottle of wine, which then was fairly reasonable. I'm sure hundreds of dollars